I stood in the back of the grand ballroom of the National Academy of Sciences, wearing a suit I had bought from a thrift store for $11, and had pressed twice with an iron borrowed from the woman in the apartment next to mine. On the stage, Dr. Marcus Sterling was holding a trophy the size of a child and a check for $1 million, and he was smiling the way he smiled in all his photographs. The smile of a man who has never once, in 55 years of living, been made to account for the difference between what he deserved and what he took. The crowd was on its feet, scientists and investors and journalists and federal grant officers and deans of engineering from 7 universities, all of them applauding a man who was standing in the brightest light the National Science Foundation could arrange, accepting recognition for a breakthrough in quantum data rendering that would, over the next decade, reshape how computational systems handled three-dimensional information at speeds previously considered theoretical. My breakthrough, my 5 years, my ramen noodles and my burned hands from the server racks that ran too hot in the basement lab, and my $3 grocery store coffee, and the specific, grinding exhaustion of a person who has no safety net and has decided that the only currency they will ever have is the thing they are building in a windowless room while the rest of the world sleeps. Sterling smiled for the cameras. He said, asterisk, my algorithm and my research and my decade of work leading to this moment, asterisk. And each time he said asterisk, my asterisk, the word landed in my chest like something with a weight to it. And I let it land because I needed to feel it, because what I was about to do required the feeling to be present and real and not managed into something smaller, buried in the three-dimensional data model rotating on the 50-foot screen behind him. The beautiful, complex, rotating visualization of a quantum rendering process that the crowd had gasped at when it appeared, that 3 separate journalists had already described in their live blog coverage as asterisk visually stunning, and a new vocabulary for scientific visualization, was a message. Not visible yet. Not to Sterling, not to the crowd, not to the cameras. Invisible the way certain things are invisible until you know what to look for and where to apply the pressure that makes them appear. I had put it there. I was not in the ballroom to cry about what had been done to me. I was not there to make a scene or a speech or an appeal to anyone's conscience. I was there to ask a single technical question during the Q&A session, a question whose answer was already encoded in the data on the screen, waiting with the patient, mathematical certainty of something that has been armed and set and cannot be unset. To understand how a man who hadn't produced original research in 11 years walked into a digital guillotine of his own arrogant construction, you have to go back. Back to the basement lab, back to the breakthrough, back to the morning I made the mistake of trusting someone who had already decided what my work was worth to him. I grew up in the foster system, which means I grew up understanding that the world did not have a default position of goodwill toward me, and that the things I wanted required a different kind of strategy than the things wanted by people who had someone to call when things went wrong. I had learned this the way children in my situation learn most things, not as a lesson someone taught me, but as a texture, a quality of the air in every room I inhabited, a fact so ambient it stopped feeling like information and started feeling like weather. My brain was my only currency. I had known this since I was 9 years old and had figured out a math problem that my teacher had put on the board as a joke, something she had told the class was beyond their level, and had watched her expression change when I brought my solution to her desk. The expression had contained surprise, which I expected, and something else that I recognized even at 9 as the specific look of a person recalibrating their category for you. I had filed that look away. I had been producing it in teachers and professors ever since, and it had opened enough doors that I had arrived, at 22, at a fully funded PhD position in computational physics at one of the 15 best research universities in the country. The funding covered tuition and a stipend. The stipend was enough for rent in a studio apartment 12 minutes from campus by bicycle, groceries at the level of a person who had learned to think of food as fuel rather than pleasure, and nothing else. No safety net, no parental backup, no card to call in when the server I needed to run my simulation cost $200 a month I didn't have, and had to be paid for by skipping the month's protein and running on pasta, and whatever the dining hall was throwing out at the end of service. I had been assigned to Dr. Marcus Sterling's lab as a condition of the funding. Sterling was a tenured full professor and the recipient of 3 major federal grants, which meant the university had institutional reasons to assign him promising students regardless of whether he was doing anything useful with them. His reputation had been built on 2 papers published 11 years earlier, genuinely important work, the kind that gets cited in other people's significant work, and produces a reputation that outlasts the research by decades if you're careful about how you manage it. Sterling was very careful about how he managed it. He attended conferences. He gave keynotes at events where the keynote fee was paid by the organizing institution. He sat on grant review committees and editorial boards and advisory panels, and he was good at all of those things. And they kept his name in circulation in the right rooms among the right people. And the lab continued receiving funding, and the funding continued paying for students, and the students continued doing the actual research, and the actual research continued generating papers on which Sterling's name appeared first or second, depending on how much of the work he had pretended to supervise. I understood this within 6 months of arriving. It was not unique to Sterling. It was, I had come to understand, a structural feature of research universities at a certain tier, where the reputation economy and the funding economy had long since decoupled from the production economy in ways that benefited the people with the longest CVs and the most institutional connections. I understood it, and I made peace with it because I had not come to Sterling's lab for Sterling. I had come for the equipment, the access, and the problem. The problem was quantum data rendering. The specific technical challenge was this. 3-dimensional data sets of quantum system states were computationally expensive to render at full resolution in real time, which meant that simulations of quantum processes, which were by nature 3-dimensional, probabilistic, and temporally dense, had to be downsampled to the point of losing information in order to be visualized at speeds useful for analysis. The loss of information was the problem. A simulation you couldn't fully visualize was a simulation you couldn't fully understand, and a simulation you couldn't fully understand produced conclusions you couldn't fully trust. I had been working on an algorithm that would eliminate the downsampling requirement. Theoretically, it was possible. The math suggested a path through a class of transform functions that hadn't been applied to this problem before. A path that existed on paper but whose implementation was the part that was supposed to be impossible. I worked on it for 5 years. The lab in the basement of the Computational Sciences building had no windows. The fluorescent lights ran on a motion sensor that turned off after 8 minutes of perceived stillness, which meant that during the long stretches when I was seated in front of a monitor and not moving, the room would go dark, and I would have to wave an arm at the sensor to bring it back. A ritual I performed so many times over 5 years that it became as automatic as breathing. I ran the servers during off-peak hours, between midnight and 6 a.m., because the department allocated computing time and the overnight window was the cheapest. I slept when the runs were processing, 4 and 5 hours at a stretch on a cot I had brought from the apartment because commuting home and back was time the algorithm didn't have. I ate what I could afford. I wore what I had. I didn't go to the conferences or the department socials or the seminars that weren't directly relevant to the problem, because time was the one resource I had in finite supply, and I was not willing to spend it on anything that wasn't the work. And then on a Tuesday night in March, at 3:17 in the morning, in the windowless basement lab with the fluorescent lights burning, and the servers running at full capacity and a coffee cup that had been empty for 2 hours, the algorithm compiled. I ran the verification sequence 4 times. Each time, it returned the same output, complete, lossless rendering of a full-resolution quantum state dataset at a processing speed 47 times faster than the current benchmark. I sat in the lab for a long time without moving, and the motion sensor turned the lights off, and I sat in the dark and I cried. Not dramatically, quietly, with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running toward something for 5 years, and has just arrived and doesn't have enough left to celebrate. Only enough to confirm that it's real and let the confirmation become, slowly, something that feels like what it is. It was real. The algorithm worked. It was the most significant advance in quantum visualization since the field existed, and I had built it in a windowless basement on a graduate student stipend and thrift store coffee, and 5 years of the kind of focused, sustained, unrelenting work that is only available to a person who has decided that the work is the only thing. I told Sterling the next morning, I want to be precise about this because it matters. I told him because it was the correct professional step, because the research had been conducted in his lab with equipment under his grant, because the university had protocols for disclosure of significant results, and because I was 27 years old and had spent 5 years in an institution that had taught me. through its structure if not through anyone's explicit instruction, that the pathway from a research result to a career in that field ran through the people with institutional authority over that field, and Sterling had institutional authority over me. I brought a printed summary. I showed him the verification outputs on my laptop. I explained the transform function, the implementation, the benchmark comparison. I watched his face while I talked, which I always did when I was presenting something technical, because the face tells you what the words don't about whether the understanding is landing. His face did something I had not seen it do before. He was still, not with the stillness of concentration, but with the stillness of a person who has just encountered something that has reorganized the calculation they were running about something else. His eyes moved across the benchmark comparison with a quality of attention he had never applied to my work in 5 years of nominal supervision. "This is preliminary," he said, "not a question, a position. The verification checks out at 4 iterations," I said. "I'd want to run it on the larger dataset to confirm its scale, but the math is solid." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing something he was not going to process out loud. "Leave the hard drives with me," he said. "I'll need to review the underlying data before we talk about next steps. Publication strategy is something we should discuss carefully." I left the hard drives. He did not review the data for publication. 2 days later, at 9 in the morning, I received an email from the dean's office requesting my immediate presence for a formal meeting regarding a matter of academic integrity. I sat in a chair across from the dean of the School of Engineering and a university council attorney in Sterling, who had arranged his face into the specific expression of a man performing reluctant concern, and I watched him slide a printed report across the desk and say, in the measured tone of someone who has rehearsed a performance until it sounds unrehearsed, that he had discovered, in reviewing what I had provided him, evidence that I had accessed his private research server without authorization and misappropriated materials from his decade-long research program. The report was 30 pages. It had been prepared by someone who understood how to assemble institutional documentation, time-stamped access logs, that I had never produced, comparison analyses between my files and files attributed to Sterling's server, a letter from the university's IT security department confirming an unauthorized access event that had supposedly occurred from a workstation in the basement lab. None of it had happened, but none of it needed to have happened. It needed only to be documented, and it was documented, and the man presenting it was a tenured professor with 3 federal grants and 30 years of institutional relationships. And I was a 27-year-old student from the foster system with no lawyer, and no one to call and nothing to stand on except the truth, which the room had already decided was not the operating currency of the proceeding. The dean spoke carefully about the university's obligations to protect the integrity of its research programs. The council attorney spoke carefully about the legal exposure associated with unauthorized server access. Sterling sat with his hands folded and his expression composed and said nothing except, once, that he hoped this could be resolved without the federal authorities needing to become involved. My lab access was revoked that afternoon. My student status was terminated effective immediately. A security officer walked me to the lab to collect my personal items, 1 backpack's worth, because I had never been the kind of person who accumulated things, and then walked me to the building's entrance and held the door open. It was raining. I stood outside the computational sciences building in the rain with my backpack over one shoulder and my bicycle lock key in my pocket, and my lab ID card confiscated, and 5 years of the most significant research of my life in the possession of a man who was going to present it as his own to every institution that mattered. And I let the rain land on my face for a moment before I put my hood up. I walked to my apartment. I changed my clothes. I sat down at my personal laptop, the cheap one, the consumer-grade machine I used for everything that wasn't the lab work. And I opened a file in an encrypted partition I had set up 2 years earlier, not because I had known specifically what Sterling would do, but because I had watched him long enough to understand the general shape of what he was capable of. The file was a complete backup of the algorithm, the datasets, the verification outputs, and the development logs, everything from the past 5 years, copied incrementally to an external server I paid for out of my own stipend, under my own account, with no connection to the university's infrastructure. But it wasn't just a backup. I looked at the file for a long time in the blue light of the laptop screen. in the small apartment that smelled of rain coming through a window that didn't seal properly. And I felt the specific, cold clarity of a person who has been betrayed so completely that all the ordinary emotional responses have been burned away, leaving only the part of the mind that runs on math. "You didn't just steal the data, Marcus," I said, to the file, to the rain, to the windowless lab I would never go back to. "You stole the bomb." The coffee shop was called Meridian, which Leo found mildly ironic given that a meridian was a reference line, the thing you measured everything else from. And he was currently the person who had built the reference point for an entire subfield of computational physics, and was now measuring out single-origin pour-overs for people who worked in the tech sector, and talked about disruption while he cleaned the steam wand. He had found the job 3 days after the expulsion, because 3 days was the amount of time his savings could cover before the rent calculation became a problem he couldn't solve by ignoring it. He worked 30 hours a week, opening shifts, when he could get them, because opening shifts ended early enough to leave the afternoon free. And the afternoons were for the work he was doing on the consumer laptop in the apartment with the leaking window. Not the algorithm. That was done. What he was doing in the afternoons was more specific and more patient than that. He had started it 6 months before the expulsion. This was the part that required some explanation, because the natural question was, if he had suspected Sterling long enough to prepare for the theft, why had he still handed over the hard drives? The answer was 2 things, both true simultaneously. The first was that he had not been certain. Suspicion in a person with a mathematical mind operates differently than suspicion in a person who runs on instinct. It requires a threshold of evidence before it converts into action, and the threshold had not been reached at the moment he handed over the drives. The second was that the preparation he had made did not require certainty. It was designed to function in the event of theft, which meant that its activation was conditional rather than immediate. If Sterling left the data alone, the preparation cost nothing. If Sterling took it, the preparation became everything. The preparation was called steganography. Steganography is the practice of hiding information inside other information. Not encryption. Encryption makes information unreadable but detectable, which is to say anyone looking at an encrypted file knows there is something being protected. Steganography makes information invisible, present in plain sight, undetectable unless you know it is there and know specifically how to retrieve it. The word comes from the Greek for asterisk-covered writing, and the practice predates digital technology by centuries. Messages hidden in the spacing of letters, in the specific words chosen in an apparently innocent text, in patterns invisible to the casual eye and legible only to the person who knows the key. In digital form, steganography works by exploiting the noise floor of data, the small, subperceptual variations that exist in any complex dataset, and that human perception and standard analysis tools are trained to ignore because they appear to be random variation rather than signal. A digital image, for example, has millions of pixels, each with color values that can be adjusted by single units, from 127 to 128 in a scale of 0 to 255, without any visible change to the human eye. Those single-unit adjustments can be made to encode binary information at a density that makes the resulting image indistinguishable from the original while containing, for anyone who knows to apply the retrieval algorithm, an entirely separate layer of data. Leo had done something considerably more complex than encoding a message in image pixels. The dataset he had developed over 5 years was a 3-dimensional model of quantum system states, a structure that existed in X, Y, and Z axes, with thousands of data points per axis and temporal components that added a 4th dimension of information. The visualization of this dataset was what the crowd at the National Academy had gasped at, a rotating 3-dimensional structure of extraordinary complexity and beauty, the kind of thing that made people who understood what they were looking at go quiet. What Leo had done to the Z-axis microvalues, the smallest scale variations in the 3rd-dimensional component of the dataset, the ones that existed below the resolution of standard rendering analysis, and were, in a visualization of this complexity, invisible to any tool Sterling would think to apply, was this. He had adjusted them, data point by data point across the entire structure, according to a specific encoding scheme that mapped binary values to microvariations in a range of plus or minus 0.003 units on the Z-axis scale. The adjustment was invisible in normal rendering. The model looked exactly as it was supposed to look. The three-dimensional structure rotated beautifully, the data points distributed according to the algorithm's output, the visualization doing precisely what it was designed to do. But if you applied a Fourier transform to the z-axis variables, a specific mathematical operation that decomposed the z-axis data into its frequency components, separating the structural information from the microvariation noise, the noise resolved. What had appeared as random subperceptual variation became, when the transform was applied, a pattern. And the pattern, decoded from binary according to the encoding scheme Leo had designed, produced text. Specifically, it produced, "This algorithm was written by Leo VANCE, property of Leo VANCE," repeated 47 times across the full extent of the dataset, because 47 was the number he had arrived at when he calculated what redundancy level would make the message irremovable without destroying the structural integrity of the dataset itself. You could not take the message out. The message was load-bearing. Leo had encoded this into the dataset 8 months before Sterling stole it, during a week when he had been running verification checks on the algorithm's core function, and had had the specific, cold intuition that precedes a decision you make before you fully understand why you're making it. He had spent 3 days on the encoding, careful, methodical, the kind of work that required the same sustained attention as the algorithm itself. And then he had continued with the verification checks, and had not thought about the encoding again until the morning he sat in the dean's office and watched Sterling slide a report across a desk. He thought about it then, sitting in that chair, in the specific, suspended stillness of a person absorbing a betrayal of this size. The encoding had come back to him with the quality of something that had been waiting patiently for its moment to be relevant. It was relevant now. The question was when. Sterling's ascent, in the months after the expulsion, was rapid in the way that reputations rise when a genuine breakthrough is attached to a name that already has institutional momentum. The algorithm, Leo's algorithm, presented as Sterling's algorithm, published under Sterling's name in 3 separate journals with acknowledgement footnotes thanking his dedicated graduate research team, a phrase so vague it could not be disproved, and so collective it excluded no one specifically, generated exactly the response that a result of that magnitude generates in a field that has been waiting for it. Leo watched from the Meridian coffee shop on a Tuesday evening, on his phone propped against the espresso machine between customers, as Sterling appeared on a science podcast with 11 million subscribers, and explained, in the warm, accessible language of a man who has had practice making complex things sound personal, the journey that had led to the breakthrough. "It was years of intuition," Sterling said. "I've always believed that the answer to the rendering problem existed in the transform functions. It was a matter of following that belief through the mathematics until the path became clear." Leo made a latte for a woman in a green coat and did not look at his phone again until she had her drink and her receipt and had moved toward the door. He watched Sterling's hands as he talked, the gestures of a man who had absorbed the language of the work well enough to perform fluency in it, who could describe the shape of the algorithm without fully understanding its architecture. The way a person can describe the plot of a book they've only read the summary of, and can be convincing about it in social settings, but will fail immediately under specific technical questioning. Specific technical questioning was what Leo was building toward. He needed a public moment, not a legal proceeding. He had consulted, in the weeks after the expulsion, with a legal aid attorney who had been honest with him about the landscape. The university's documentation was sophisticated. The statute of limitations on the technical violations Sterling had alleged was structured in ways that created procedural obstacles, and the cost of litigation against an institution with the legal resources of a major research university was beyond anything Leo's financial reality could support. The legal path was real but slow and expensive and uncertain. What Leo needed was not a legal proceeding. He needed a scientific one. He needed the question asked in a room full of scientists, in front of cameras, at a moment when Sterling could not redirect the answer or shut down the demonstration or invoke institutional process to delay what the data would show. The National Science Foundation's Innovator of the Decade announcement came on a Thursday morning, on the NSF's website and simultaneous press release to 17 science and technology publications. Dr. Marcus Sterling, the announcement read, had been selected for the award on the basis of his revolutionary contribution to quantum data rendering, a contribution that represented, in the judgment of the selection committee, the most significant advance in computational visualization in the preceding decade. The award included a $1 million prize, a gold-plated trophy the announcement described as the largest in the Foundation's collection, and a live ceremony at the National Academy of Sciences building, broadcast to an audience of scientists, investors, federal grant administrators, and journalists covering the science beat for every major publication in the country. Leo read the announcement 3 times at the coffee shop's back counter, on his phone between the morning rush and the lunch service, and felt something in his chest do what it did when a calculation that had been running in the background of everything else resolved. The ceremony was in 6 weeks. The format included a keynote presentation by the recipient, a Q&A session, and a live demonstration of the awarded research, which meant the dataset would be displayed on the presentation system, which meant the visualization would be on screen, which meant the specific mathematical relationship between the z-axis microvalues and a Fourier transform was one command away from being visible to everyone in the room and everyone watching the broadcast. He needed to be in the room. The building's security for the event was not difficult to research. The National Academy published its event management protocols for major ceremonies in a facility's document accessible through their public-facing administrative pages, because institutions at that level are required to file certain event logistics with the city for permitting purposes, and those filings are public record. Lee spent an evening reading them. The perimeter was controlled. Press credentials required advance verification. Guest lists were closed. There was no walk-up access to the event. Catering staff were managed through a contracted event services company, whose vehicles would have building access through the service entrance. Leo had been thinking about this for 3 days when the Meridian's lunch delivery from a food supplier arrived on a Tuesday morning in a truck that parked in the alley beside the building, and the driver who brought in the produce order mentioned, making conversation while Leo signed the delivery receipt, that the catering company he worked for on weekends was understaffed for a big science event the following month, and was taking on additional temporary staff if anyone was interested. Leo finished signing the receipt. He set the pen down. He looked at the driver for a moment with the specific attention of a person who has just been handed something they have been calculating toward for 6 weeks. "What's the name of the company?" he said. He got the job on a Thursday afternoon, hired on the spot by an event coordinator who needed bodies and found Leo's schedule availability acceptable and his demeanor adequately professional. He attended 2 orientation sessions, learned the service protocol for the National Academy event, and was assigned to champagne service in the main ballroom for the duration of the reception and ceremony. He did not tell anyone at the coffee shop he was leaving. He gave his notice, worked his final shift, cleaned the steam wand one last time with the methodical care he had applied to every task in that job that was worth doing carefully, hung up his apron, and walked out of the Meridian into an afternoon that had the specific quality of days when what comes next is already determined, and the only remaining variable is execution. He had one remaining preparation to make. The AV booth at the National Academy's ballroom was staffed for large events by a 2-person technical team. One of them, Leo had determined through the event services company's logistics documentation, and a subsequent conversation with a former National Academy AV technician he had found through an online professional network, was a graduate student in the electrical engineering department of a university in the city who took event work to supplement his funding. Leo had contacted him through the professional network, not with the full story, with a question, framed as a technical research inquiry, about the rendering software the National Academy used for its presentation systems. The conversation had been genuinely technical, and the graduate student had been genuinely helpful, and in the course of 3 exchanges, Leo had confirmed 2 things. The rendering software used a standard Fourier analysis plugin that was already installed on the presentation system, and the graduate student understood enough about data visualization to know what it would mean if someone asked him to run a specific transform command on a live dataset mid-presentation. Leo had told him in the 3rd exchange exactly what the command would produce. The graduate student had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "If someone asked me to run that command during a live broadcast, I would need a technical justification." Leo had sent him 3 pages of documentation: the development logs, the encoding specification, the mathematical proof that the z-axis microvalues in the dataset were not random variation. The graduate student had taken 12 hours to respond. His response was 4 words, "I'll be there Saturday." Leo read it in his apartment on the cheap laptop, in the evening light that came through the window that didn't seal properly and let in the sound of the street below. He closed the laptop. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he went to the closet where he had hung the $11 thrift store suit. And he checked, one more time, that the press had held. Saturday was 6 days away. He had been waiting 6 months. 6 days was nothing. The service entrance of the National Academy of Sciences building opened into a corridor that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and heated metal, which was the smell of every back-of house in every venue Leo had ever worked in or passed through. The specific, honest smell of the infrastructure that made the front of house possible. The smell of the people who kept things running while other people accepted awards for things they hadn't built. He arrived at 4:30, 2 hours before the doors opened to guests, with the catering company's other event staff. 11 people in total, in black trousers and white shirts and the short black aprons that would be exchanged for longer ones during the dinner service. The event coordinator ran them through the evening's timeline in the corridor, her tablet in one hand and a radio clipped to her belt. The efficient authority of someone who had staffed 100 events like this and knew exactly how many things could go wrong and had protocols for most of them. Leo listened. He filled glasses in the orientation mock-up she ran in the prep area. He nodded when she told him his station was the reception floor, champagne service. Keep the flutes filled and the trays moving and stay out of the sightlines of the cameras during the ceremony portion. He would not be staying out of the sightlines of the cameras, but he said nothing about that. The guests began arriving at 6:30, and Leo moved through the reception floor with a tray of champagne flutes and the specific, cultivated invisibility of a service worker at a high-end event, which is to say he was present in every peripheral vision in the room and registered in none of them. This was a skill he had acquired at the Meridian and refined over the preceding months, the ability to occupy a space completely without generating the social signal that would make anyone look at him directly. It was, he had reflected more than once, a version of the same skill he had applied in Sterling's lab for 5 years, being present enough to do the work and invisible enough that no one thought to look at what the work was becoming. He saw the Dean of Engineering at 7:03, standing near the East Bar with a glass of red wine and a conversation with 2 people Leo recognized as NSF grant officers. The Dean had aged slightly in the months since the morning he had sat across a desk and listened to Sterling describe Leo as a troubled young man, or had not aged and only appeared to have, the way people appear to age when you look at them through the lens of what they did. He was laughing at something. His glass was nearly empty. Leo offered him a champagne flute from the tray. The Dean took it without looking at the person offering it. Leo moved on. He saw Sterling at 7:20, arriving with the composed assurance of the evening's honoree, dressed in the kind of suit that announced its cost without specifying it, accompanied by 2 colleagues from the university and a woman who appeared to be his publicist based on the phone she was holding, and the way she angled him toward the photographers near the entrance. Sterling was doing the thing he did in every room, radiating the ease of a man who had decided, long ago, that rooms existed to receive him, and had been correct about this often enough that the belief had calcified into something indistinguishable from his actual personality. He did not look toward the catering staff. People like Sterling never did. Leo kept his tray level and moved toward the north end of the reception floor. At 7:55, the event coordinator's voice came through the radio clipped to the lapel of the senior catering manager, instructing the service staff to begin clearing the reception area in preparation for the ceremony. Leo set his tray on the service station near the corridor entrance, removed the champagne apron, and replaced it with the longer dinner service apron that the evening's second phase required. He moved with the other staff toward their ceremony positions, which for the champagne service team meant the perimeter of the main ballroom, stationed at intervals along the side walls during the presentation in case guests required anything during the program. His position, assigned by the event coordinator 2 days earlier when she had done the floor layout, was the left side wall, midpoint, approximately 40 feet from the stage and 12 feet from the press stand, where the audiovisual team had positioned a spare wireless microphone on a stand for the Q and A portion of the program. He had not arranged this positioning. He had simply noted it on the floor layout document the event coordinator had shared with all catering staff during the second orientation session, and had said nothing about it, and had shown up at his assigned position this evening with the unhurried certainty of a person who has confirmed that the variables they could not control have arranged themselves acceptably. The ceremony began at 8 o'clock. The host, a science journalist with a television presence that Leo recognized from a documentary series he had watched in the lab during processing runs, opened with the kind of contextual framing that award ceremonies required. The state of the field, the significance of the specific problem that had been solved, the rarity of the kind of breakthrough that warranted a gathering of this kind. She was good at it. The framing was accurate, which was the part that required the specific discipline of sitting still and listening to a correct description of his work attributed to someone else. Leo stood at his position along the left wall and held his hands in front of him and listened. The biographical package played on the screen, Sterling's career, his earlier publications, the arc of a scientist's life assembled from photographs and interview clips into the shape of a story that had a destination, and the destination was tonight. Leo watched it the way he had watched the podcast appearance, with the cold, recording attention of a person cataloging performance, noting the specific phrases that had been refined across multiple tellings, the moments where the narrative had been shaped around the absence of certain information, the way a sculpture is shaped around absence. Sterling took the stage at 8:22. He accepted the trophy and the check with the rehearsed humility of a man who had been accepting recognition for long enough to understand that humility, in these moments, is a form of amplification. That saying "I don't deserve this" in the right tone makes the room insist that you do. He said several sentences that Leo stopped listening to and started watching the screen behind the podium for, because the screen was where the next 10 minutes lived. The visualization appeared at 8:29. Leo had been prepared for it. He had seen it thousands of times over 5 years of development, had watched it render and re-render through dozens of iterations, had the specific relationship with it that a person has with something they built with their own hands over a long enough period that the thing and the person become associated in the mind in a way that is difficult to separate. He was prepared for it. He was not fully prepared for what it felt like to see it on a 50-foot screen, in a room full of people who were encountering it for the first time. The three-dimensional model rotated slowly on the screen, the data points moving through the rendering space with the specific, complex elegance of a structure that had been built to reflect something real about quantum system states at the fundamental level, something true about how information existed in physical space, rendered visually in a way that made the truth of it perceptible to a human standing in a room looking at a screen. It was beautiful in the specific way that things built from mathematics are beautiful, not decoratively but structurally, beauty as a consequence of accuracy. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something on a screen has earned the silence. The head of the NSF selection committee, seated in the front row, leaned forward slightly. The science journalists had stopped making notes. The federal grant officers, the people in the room whose institutional function was to identify work worth funding and ensure it went where it belonged, were looking at the screen with the focused attention of people who understood what they were looking at. Sterling stood at the podium with his hand extended toward the screen in the gesture of a man presenting something he had made, and the light from the projection fell across him. And he was, in this moment, exactly what the room believed him to be. Leo looked at the AV booth, positioned at the rear right corner of the ballroom, elevated slightly on a platform that gave the technicians sightlines to the screen and the stage. He could see, through the booth's glass panel, two figures, one of them the graduate student, recognizable by the yellow lanyard Leo had been told to look for, who was at the secondary console rather than the primary one, which was where the rendering software controls were. The graduate student was looking at the stage. Leo looked back at the stage. Sterling had moved from the visual presentation into the verbal component of the keynote, explaining the algorithm's function in the accessible, jargon-managed language of a man who understood the shape of the work well enough to describe it without understanding its architecture. The explanation was broadly accurate and specifically hollow, the description of a traveler who has visited a place and can tell you what it looked like but cannot tell you how it was built. Leo listened for the technical language. He heard asterisk transform functions, which was right. He heard asterisk z-axis optimization asterisk, which was partially right. He heard asterisk novel application of frequency decomposition, which was so close to accurate that it required knowing the actual implementation to hear what was missing from it. What was missing was the specific transform, the specific function applied to the specific axis at the specific scale that produced the specific result. What Sterling did not say, because he did not know it, because understanding what Leo had done required building it rather than reading about it, was the Fourier transform on the z-axis micro-values. That was the gap, the question Leo had been preparing for 6 months. At 8:51, Sterling concluded the technical presentation and stepped back from the podium. The host moved to center stage. "We have a few minutes for technical questions," she said, addressing the room with the warmth of a moderator who genuinely liked this part of events like this, the moment when the gathered expertise in a room was given permission to engage the honoree directly. "Does anyone have a question for Dr. Sterling regarding the research?" 2 hands went up near the front. Journalists from the press section. The host indicated the first one, a question about publication timeline. Sterling answered. The second question about potential commercial applications. Sterling answered. The host looked toward the back of the room, scanning for additional hands. Leo reached behind him and removed the catering apron. He folded it neatly, the way he had been taught in the orientation, and set it on the service station beside him. He straightened his shirt. He stepped away from the wall, into the aisle that ran along the left side of the ballroom, and he walked to the press stand where the spare wireless microphone sat on its stand. And he picked it up, and he clicked it active, and the small red light on its base came on, and the sound system's ambient register shifted by a fraction as the new active microphone entered the mix. 300 people in the ballroom heard the shift. A number of them turned toward it. Leo stepped into the main aisle. "I have a question, doctor," he said, and his voice in the room's sound system was level and clear, and carried the specific, quiet authority of a person who has been thinking about this sentence for 6 months and has no more nervousness left in relation to it. Only the clarity that comes after nervousness has been burned entirely away by time and preparation. Sterling squinted into the spotlight from the stage. The room turned toward Leo, and the room, turning, saw a 27-year-old man in a white catering shirt, standing in the main aisle of the National Academy of Sciences ballroom holding a wireless microphone with the composure of someone who had built the thing on the 50-foot screen and was about to prove it. Sterling saw him at the same moment the room did. The recognition moved through his face in a sequence that Leo watched with the focused attention he had brought to everything connected to this evening. First, the squint of a man trying to resolve a figure in his peripheral vision. Then the specific sharpening of identification. Then something that was not quite fear and not quite confidence, but occupied the register between them. The place where a person lands when they have encountered a threat they believed they had permanently neutralized and are discovering. In real time, that permanence was not the property they thought it was. Sterling straightened at the podium. He put his hands on its edges with the controlled physicality of a man reestablishing his relationship to the space around him. He looked at Leo with the expression he had worn in the dean's office. The composed, institutional authority of a person who has used that authority before and trusts it. "Security," he said. His voice was calm. He had the microphone, which meant his calmness went into the sound system and into the room and onto the broadcast, and he was using that calmness as its own kind of argument, the measured response of a man addressing a known variable, not a threat. "I'm going to ask you to escort this individual from the building. He is a former student who was dismissed from my program following a serious investigation into academic misconduct. This is not an appropriate venue." "Dr. Sterling," Leo said, and the wireless microphone in his hand was equally present in the sound system, equally in the room, equally on the broadcast, and his voice was not performing calm the way Sterling's was. His voice was simply calm, which was a different thing, and the room could tell the difference. Sterling stopped. The host, standing to the side of the stage with the specific, professional paralysis of a moderator whose event has departed from its program in a way that has no protocol, looked between them with the expression of someone who understood that whatever happened next would define the rest of the evening regardless of what she did, and who had decided the correct response was stillness. 2 security officers had begun moving from the perimeter toward Leo's position in the aisle. He was aware of them. He had calculated them into the timeline. "Since you wrote this algorithm," Leo said, his voice carrying with the clear, level quality of someone who has rehearsed nothing and is simply saying a true thing, "I'd like to ask you about the rendering architecture. Specifically, what happens when you apply a Fourier transform to the z-axis micro-values of the dataset?" He paused for exactly 1 beat. "I've sent the command to the AV booth." He had sent it 17 seconds ago, in a text message composed and cued before he had picked up the microphone, sent at the moment he clicked the microphone active. Sterling's hands tightened on the podium edges. "Remove him," he said, and this time the calm was thinner, the authority doing more of the structural work and less of the genuine work. the difference audible to anyone in the room who was listening for it rather than simply hearing it. The security officers reached Leo. One of them put a hand on his arm. On the 50-foot screen behind the podium, the three-dimensional model continued its slow rotation, the data points moving through the rendering space with the unhurried elegance of something built to last. And then it stopped. Not the rotation, the model. The entire structure paused mid-rotation, a freeze that lasted less than a second, the visual hesitation of a rendering system receiving a new instruction, processing it, preparing to execute. The graduate student in the AV booth had run the command. What happened to the 50-foot screen in the next 4 seconds was the thing that Leo had calculated and built and encoded and waited 6 months and 5 years to see. And he watched it happen with the specific quality of attention he had brought to the algorithm's compilation at 3:17 in the morning in the windowless basement lab. Complete, present. The attention of a person who has been building toward a moment for long enough that, when the moment arrives, they are entirely there for it. The data points began to move, not the rotation of the model, something different, a reorganization, each individual point shifting from its position in the three-dimensional structure to a new position according to the encoding scheme. The z-axis micro-values that had been adjusted, data point by data point, 8 months before the theft, now resolving through the Fourier transform into their intended configuration. The random appearing noise of subperceptual variation assembling itself, with the inevitability of mathematics. Into signal, the points moved quickly, the structure deconstructed and reconstructed in the same motion, the beautiful three-dimensional rendering dissolving into 2 dimensions, the complexity giving way to simplicity, the complex data points rearranging on the black background of the screen with the finality of something that had always been there and was now simply visible. Bright red letters on a black background 50 feet high. This algorithm was written by Leo VANCE, property of Leo VANCE. Then the second iteration, and the third, the message repeating across the full extent of the dataset. As the transform worked through its range, 47 iterations of the same text assembling themselves in sequence across the screen, in the time it took the room to understand what it was looking at. The room understood in the way that rooms understand things that have no precedent in their experience, not all at once, but in a wave, starting at the front where the screen was closest, and the text was most immediate, moving back through the tiered rows of scientists and journalists and grant officers and deans, the wave of understanding cresting and breaking as it went, carrying with it everything that understanding of this kind carries. The shock of the thing itself, and the implications of the thing, arriving simultaneously and requiring the mind to hold both at once. The Dean of Engineering dropped his champagne glass. Leo heard it shatter from 40 feet away in a room that had gone very quiet very fast. The head of the NSF selection committee was on her feet, not dramatically. She stood the way a person stands when the situation they are in has exceeded the seating posture they arrived in, when the development requires a different relationship to gravity. She was looking at the screen with the expression of a federal administrator who has just seen the most significant public evidence of fraud in the history of her institution's award program displayed on a 50-foot screen in front of 300 witnesses and a live broadcast. Sterling had let go of the podium. He had taken a step back from it. A single step, involuntary, the physical response of a body receiving information before the mind has completed its processing. He was looking at the screen. Leo could see his face from the aisle, the face of a man watching the specific, irrevocable collapse of something he had believed was structurally sound, whose faith in its soundness had been so complete that the collapse arrived not as a fear realized, but as a physical impossibility encountering physical reality. The security officer's hand was still on Leo's arm. Leo looked at him. The officer looked at the screen. His hand loosened. Leo stepped back from him gently, and the officer let him. The message repeats 47 times across the full dataset, Leo said into the microphone. His voice was the same as it had been, level, clear, without performance. The encoding is steganographic. It uses micro-variations in the z-axis values, adjusted at the subperceptual level before the data was stolen. The variations are load-bearing. They cannot be removed without destroying the structural integrity of the dataset itself. The algorithm cannot be used without the message. He looked at the screen, at his name in red letters 50 feet high. I have the complete development logs, the original timestamp files, and the encoding specification on a verified external server. The metadata is dated 8 months before Dr. Sterling reported the data as his own. The NSF selection committee head had her phone to her ear. She was not calling anyone celebratory. Sterling moved from behind the podium, not toward Leo. He moved laterally, toward the stage steps, with the directionless momentum of a man whose body needed to be in motion because remaining still in front of 300 people, and a live camera with his name in fraudulent ownership of a stolen algorithm on the 50-foot screen behind him was not something his nervous system could sustain. The university colleagues who had arrived with him had developed the specific, studied neutrality of people in proximity to a disaster. They were calculating how to not be associated with. The publicist was not visible. She had been standing near the east wall. She was no longer standing near the east wall. The host made a movement toward the microphone at the podium, and then did not reach it. There was nothing in the moderator's protocol for this. There was no next segment. One of the NSF's senior program officers, a woman whose name Leo knew from the grant documentation he had read during the weeks of preparation, whose specific institutional role included oversight of award integrity, crossed the floor to the stage with the deliberate, rapid movement of someone executing a decision they had already made. She spoke briefly to the ceremony's production coordinator. The production coordinator spoke into his headset. The live broadcast cut to a holding card, a blue NSF logo on a neutral background, that the network's control room had apparently been capable of deploying immediately, which suggested they had been monitoring the situation with the readiness of people who understood that what they were watching was no longer a ceremony. Sterling had reached the base of the stage steps. Two of the event's security officers, different ones from the pair who had approached Leo, senior staff, the kind who wore earpieces, were moving toward him with the unhurried, parallel approach of people who had been given an instruction and were executing it without urgency because urgency implied the subject might run, and the subject had nowhere to run. Dr. Sterling, the NSF program officer's voice from the stage, was the voice of someone with federal authority using it. "I need you to remain on the premises." Sterling stopped. He turned and looked at the screen once more. The message was still there. The Fourier transform had been applied and could not be unapplied. The rendering software displaying what the data said rather than what the data had been presented as, and what the data said was 47 iterations of a name that was not Sterling's, in letters that were visible from every seat in the ballroom, and from every camera that the broadcast had been routing through for the past 42 minutes. Leo watched him look at it. He thought about the morning in the dean's office, the printed report, the manufactured access logs, the specific, unbothered confidence of a man who had done this before in smaller ways and understood how institutions protect their own, who had believed that the student with no safety net and no backing and no one to call had been rendered permanently silent by the combination of expulsion and legal threat, and the simple, structural fact that the world tends to believe the person with the longer CV. He had believed that a ghost could be silenced. He had not understood what the ghost had built into the data before he took it. The $1 million check was on the podium. No one was touching it. The trophy was beside it, the gold-plated award for the most significant advance in computational visualization in the preceding decade, sitting in the light that the ceremony's production team had calibrated to make it look its most impressive for the broadcast, still looking its most impressive, still catching the light exactly as designed. The design had been Leo's. The federal investigators arrived at the building at 10:47, which was 41 minutes after the broadcast cut to its holding card, and the ceremony's production coordinator made a call he had apparently been instructed to make if certain conditions were met. The conditions had been met at the moment. The program officer invoked federal authority and instructed Sterling to remain on the premises, which created a formal record of an institutional representative of a federal agency exercising her authority at a federally funded event in relation to a potential federal grant fraud matter. The algorithm had been developed under a federal grant. The grant had been awarded on the basis of research attributed to Sterling. The research had not been Sterling's. The federal grant money, $10 million across 3 funding cycles, had been administered on the basis of a fraudulent attribution. Federal grant fraud, wire fraud, academic fraud at the institutional level. The program officer had been on the phone with the NSF's legal counsel before the ceremony's production coordinator had finished speaking into his headset. The investigators were in the building before Sterling's publicist had finished composing the statement she ultimately did not send. Leo was in the corridor outside the ballroom when the investigators arrived. Not hiding, standing in the corridor in his white catering shirt with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a person who has completed a calculation and is waiting for the result to finish resolving, which is not anxiety and is not celebration, but occupies the space between them where certainty lies. The NSF program officer found him there at 11:15. She was carrying a tablet and had the specific energy of a person who has been executing decisions rapidly for the past 2 hours and has not slowed down, the compressed efficiency of someone in motion. The external server, she said. The development logs, the encoding specification. Verified and time-stamped, Leo said. The files are dated. The metadata is intact. I have a chain of custody for the backup that predates the theft by 14 months. She looked at him for a moment with the assessing attention of a federal program officer who was also, underneath the institutional role, a scientist, and who had watched 47 iterations of his name appear in data that Sterling had claimed and understood, with the certainty of a person who had spent her career evaluating research integrity, what she had watched. We're going to need everything, she said. I know, Leo said. I have it ready. He pulled a USB drive from his shirt pocket. Prepared 3 weeks ago. Encrypted, with the decryption key on a document she would receive by verified email in the next 4 minutes from the address he had set up specifically for this transfer. Every file, every timestamp, every development log, the encoding specification, the external server credentials, the chain of custody documentation. She took it. She looked at it, and then at him, and something moved through her expression that had nothing to do with the federal proceeding and everything to do with the scientist underneath the program officer. The specific, private acknowledgement of a person who has seen someone else's work closely enough to understand what it cost to build it. The algorithm, she said. The actual algorithm, the original. Mine, Leo said. It always was. She nodded once, then she walked back toward the ballroom. Leo remained in the corridor. Through the ballroom's double doors, he could hear the low, continuous register of a large room in which something significant had occurred, and was still occurring. The sound of aftermath, of institutions recalibrating, of a version of events that 300 people had arrived believing being replaced, irrevocably, by a different version. He thought about the basement lab, the motion sensor that turned the lights off after 8 minutes of stillness, the cot, the $3 coffee. The morning the algorithm compiled at 3:17 a.m., and he had sat in the dark and cried with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running toward something for 5 years and has just arrived. He thought about Sterling's face in that morning's meeting, the eyes moving across the benchmark comparison with a quality of attention he had never applied to Leo's work before. He thought about the dean's office, the printed report, the way Sterling had said troubled young man with the measured compassion of someone performing reluctance. He thought about 5 years. 5 years was what it had cost. 5 years of poverty and fluorescent light and burned hands and the windowless lab and the specific, sustained commitment of a person who has no safety net and has decided that the work is the only way out. And he had built something that was true and important and permanent in the way that mathematical truth is permanent, not subject to revision based on who was claiming credit for it, not diminished by what had been done to him in the months since it was taken. The truth of it had been in the data the whole time, waiting. He went back to the service station on the left wall of the ballroom and picked up the catering apron he had left there when he stepped into the aisle. He looked at it for a moment, the short black apron of a person doing the work that keeps things running while other people accept awards. He set it on the station. He left it there. He walked back through the corridor, past the industrial cleaning solution smell and the heated metal smell and the freight elevator and the service entrance, and he pushed through the door into the night outside. The air was cold and clear in the way of late autumn nights in the city, and the street was doing the ordinary things streets do at 11 o'clock, taxis moving, a couple walking a dog, the lit windows of a restaurant 2 buildings down where people were eating dinner in complete and comfortable ignorance of what had just occurred 40 feet above them in the grand ballroom of the National Academy of Sciences. Leo stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street for a moment. His phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't recognize with a university domain he did. A different university, not the one that had expelled him. One with a computational physics department that had published 3 of the papers that had influenced his approach to the transform function problem. Mr. Vance, I'm the department chair of computational physics at university. I watched the broadcast tonight. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience about a research position with full lab access and funding. We can discuss terms at whatever level you consider appropriate. He read it twice, then he locked the phone and put it in his pocket. He would answer it. Not tonight. Tonight was not for responding to things. Tonight was for standing on a sidewalk in a cheap thrift store suit in the cold air of late autumn and letting the last 5 years finish resolving into what they were going to become. 3 more messages arrived while he stood there. He didn't read them. He would read them tomorrow, when the distance between tonight and the morning would have given the resolution time to settle into something he could look at steadily. He spent 5 years starving in a windowless lab to build a masterpiece, and his professor spent 5 seconds stealing it. He walked away from the National Academy of Sciences building without looking back at it, into the ordinary, indifferent, continuing city, carrying nothing except what he had always carried, the only currency he had ever had, the one that had built the algorithm in the basement and encoded the message in the data, and waited with the patience of someone who understood that mathematical truth does not expire. His name was in the data. It had always been in the data. It was there now, in the rendering software of the National Academy of Sciences presentation system, on the hard drives of the NSF investigators, in the broadcast recording that 47 media organizations were currently reviewing, in the verified external server with the time-stamped files that predated the theft by 14 months. He walked. The cold air was exactly what it was, cold air November. A city doing what cities do. He had walked in worse. He had walked in the rain with a backpack and a confiscated lab ID and 5 years of work in the possession of a man who believed he had silenced a ghost. He walked now as the person who had always been going to walk away from it eventually, who had always been going to be exactly what the data said he was. The city moved around him, indifferent, continuous, entirely unaware. He walked into it without hurrying. He had time,